Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Pardon me for being so casual. I'm doing this late at night, but I want to get through chapter 12, and there's a lot to it, so I'm going to count on you guys to read through it. Let me start my timer here, and I'll give you a brief lecture, if I can, over the high points. So we're in this antebellum era in American history, so this is, before the Civil War, and really this chapter is describing the run-up to the Civil War and some of the issues that caused the debates over slavery to really explode in this time period between like 1820 and almost 1860 we get up to. So most of the chapter is about politics, and so let's try to back up to the last chapter and what we knew about politics earlier. If you recall, when we were talking about the constitutional debates, really the first party system, if you will, was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and that coalition starts to fall apart in the 1820s and 1824, actually, around that time, when the parties really divide. So John Quincy Adams is running against Andrew Jackson in 1824, and they're both kind of national Republicans. There's really like just one party at that time, and Adams actually loses the popular vote and the electoral college vote, and Jackson wins both, but Jackson doesn't have a majority in the electoral college, so the House of Representatives decides that election, and because of that decision for John Quincy Adams, basically these parties form, and the one party under Jackson is the Democratic Party. So, and it's totally different than the Democratic Party today, but that's sort of the origins of it in 1824 as a result of that election with John Quincy Adams. So eventually 1828 comes along, and Jackson runs again and wins a landslide, and he's really the first regular guy president, I guess, for lack of a better term. He's from Tennessee. He's not a New England elitist like everyone before him has been, and he's viewed by what's left of the National Republican Coalition as sort of a crude country guy, not a smart guy, not an intellectual. He's a slaveholder, and so all of a sudden the presidency takes on a different turn because he's really a populist in a way. He's a war hero, but he doesn't fit the mold of an executive, if you will. He's a country guy. He's for states' rights, and he really can't stand elitist in government. That's sort of his big thing. So the point is that out of this mess over a period of time, the Democratic Party forms, and a new party forms out of what's left of the National Republicans and the anti-Mason party called the Whig Party, and that's really the second party system, is the Democrats and the Whigs. And there's some important stuff that happens there's a lot of important stuff that happens during this time, but one of the things is that when this second party system forms, the participation in elections really increases. It goes from 20% of eligible voters vote to 80%, and there's two reasons for that. One of the reasons is that prior to the 1820s and 1830s, in order to vote, you had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to own property. And so that eliminated a lot of people. In other words, there weren't a lot of eligible voters because not a lot of people owned land. The rich guys could vote, and normal middle class, lower class people like me couldn't, because maybe we didn't own property at that time. So by getting rid of or easing or relaxing these property restrictions, that really caused an increase in the democratization of the country. Made more people were eligible to vote. So that's one thing. And the other thing was that there was intense party loyalty brewing. So now that you had these two parties with real distinct differences between them, people, they like to choose sides, just like our presidential election that just ended here. So that's another reason more people came out to vote, because now people would get aligned passionately with one party or the other. So the Democratic Party in the second party system was really like the anti-federalist, if you remember. They were for small government. and the Democratic Party in this instance were pro-slavery. They were pro-westward expansion, and they were anti-federal government. They thought that states' rights were the most important thing. So that's the Democratic platform. The Whig Party, on the other hand, was a party of reform. They were a party of that believed in an activist government, and they really felt like it was important to develop the infrastructure in the territories or in the states that were already part of the Union, as opposed to trying to expand westward. So there were some pretty stark differences between the two parties, and so the constituents of Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party were like immigrants and farmers who were into expansion, and the constituents of the Whig Party, which eventually would be led by William Henry Harrison, are northern industrialists, some slaveholders actually, evangelical Protestants, and others. So that were for reform. So the party split up, and that really was the characteristic of the second party system. What happens is, though, that Jackson gets in office and he serves 2 terms and really starts to tear the country apart in a lot of ways. He didn't believe in the Second National Bank of the U.S., which is kind of like our Federal Reserve today. So he eliminated that. He had some weird ideas about money. He liked everything to be done in gold and silver and not in paper bills. And there's some legitimate reasons for that. But he was a lot different than anyone who had come before him. So Jackson was real controversial. But one of the things to think about, and you'll read it in the book, is that, party politics was just brutal when Jackson was in office. 1824, 1828, these campaigns were just awful. Jackson's wife was a divorcee. Her name was Rachel, and people were calling her a whore, and all of this stuff was going on. So if you think politics today gets nasty, 1824, 1828 in there was really a low point or a high point, if you like that stuff, in politics. So just understand that. I guess the best way to think about the second party system is, in a lot of ways, it's the modern political system taking shape, because it was the first time that political parties went out and tried to get votes with posters and songs and rallies, and both of these parties had their own party newspapers, and so it really, the introduction of modern campaigning happens during this time. So that's one of the things that's important to remember about it. Other stuff that's going on the same time, 1848, there's a big women's convention in Seneca Falls, New York. So this beginning of this drive for women's suffrage, that's the right to vote, happens with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who you've probably heard of. There's this movement towards more rights, and the abolitionists are gaining steam too, the people who are against slavery. So there's a heck of a lot going on in the country, and at the same time, the country's expanding west. You'll read about a guy, Polk, one of our presidents, and kind of starts this, he does start this Mexican-American War in 1848, and as a result of the Mexican-American War, the U.S. gets California, parts of Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and we had already annexed Texas, but you'll read how that works. So now there's all of this new land out west because of Polk's war with Mexico. Polk also gets the Oregon territories from the Brits, and that's the last piece of the country, really. So the Oregon territories were modern-day Oregon, of course, the state of Washington, and most of Idaho, and a little bit of Utah, I believe. So, Polk expands the country through war and through deals with the Brits on Oregon. And so now that the country is expanded, the big controversy is, as the country expands west, what's going to happen to slavery? In other words, if California becomes a state, is it going to be a slave state, or is it going to be a free state? So you'll read about the Compromise of 1850, which really was a trick. It really didn't do anything. It just sort of put off the inevitable. But one thing that did happen with the Compromise of 1850 was the passage of something called the Fugitive Slave Act. And the deal with the Fugitive Slave Act said that if a slave runs away and gets up to the north, up to Ohio, for example, that the slave owners can come and get them. In other words, just because a slave is on free soil doesn't mean that he or she is a free slave. So that's very controversial with the abolitionists and the people in the North. So that's going on, and really that's the crux of the chapter. Sort of the end of it is this idea of the failure of the Compromise of 1850, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the idea of popular sovereignty you'll read about, and that's this notion that, hey, new states should be able to decide whether they want to be slave states or not, so the popular vote in each state should decide, but that really fell through for a number of reasons. I mean, in the case of Kansas, they were like shipping people in that weren't residents of Kansas just to vote for slavery, so it was all trickery. There's an incident called, a massacre almost, called Bleeding Kansas that you should read about. So that happens. The Whig Party, which is part of the second party system, around 1860 starts to fall apart. The new Republican Party is born. So there's lots of things happening in politics, and a lot of it is related to this issue of slavery, that none of the political parties are really willing to face this head on until the Republican Party is born, and the Republican Party becomes the party of the North. And I guess by default, if you're the party of the North, you're going to be the anti-slavery party, and that, of course, is Abraham Lincoln's party in 1860. So Lincoln was a congressman prior to, and now he's going to run for president. You're going to read about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and it's all slavery all the time, basically, in politics, because everyone knows with the New Territory West that this issue has to come to a head, plus the fact that abolitionists in the North are really unifying, forming this coalition with women's suffrage organizations, and the Quakers. So you're getting this large group of people who are ready to oppose slavery on moral grounds. And so, it's like the issue is really coming to a head. And then lastly, you'll read about the Dred Scott case, and that's basically a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court says that Dred Scott, he's a slave, has to go wherever his master wants him to go. So it basically rules that slaves are not citizens; they have no rights. And then you'll read lastly about John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, where John Brown goes to the arsenal or the armory at Harper's Ferry and attempts to steal a bunch of weapons and start a raid on the South. And so it's a controversial time, and a lot of these things you're reading about right now, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act for sure, the birth of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln's bid for the presidency for sure with Republicans, Bleeding Canvas, Dred Scott, and Lincoln-Douglas debates, and John Brown's raid. Those are all like big events that are part of the reason the Civil War starts. Every one of these events is highly controversial. So if someone ever asks you, hey, what are some of the events that lead to the beginning of the Civil War, you can name any one of these things. The Kansas-Nebraska Act for sure, even the Fugitive Slave Act, all of these things really led to the Civil War. So it's a long chapter, but it's a really important chapter as we get into where we're going next, and it's important to understand the politics of the whole thing and understand where Abraham Lincoln fits in, because we're going to read a lot more about him soon. So that's it for now. Thanks a lot. Have a great week. Take care now. Bye-bye.